Hey everybody, it's Bust with our final segment on the Legends of Runeterra Standard Rotation 2024 preview, and we'll be covering off on the last three. That makes it the final segment, right? It's going to be three in this one. It's going to be Shadow Isles, Targon, and Shurima. I would call them all the factions nobody cares about, but we already covered off on Ionia, and they're probably at number one. But to dive in, four champions coming out of Shadow Isles. It's a bit odd to see that, but I guess it makes sense in terms of the kind of overall ideas with the rotation and cutting out the linear strategies. So if all of the darkness cards are coming out, then both Vagar and Senna need to go, and then a big chunk of the cards coming out the remainder of the way are darkness-based cards. So Ixtali Sentinel, Dessen Ada, things like Solari Sentinel, that all makes sense well and good. Same thing kind of applies to Nightfall. We see Nocturne coming out and then other pieces of the Nightfall kit being removed. And so down this other way, where are you at? Just dum-dums like Dusk Rider that nobody ever played, getting the cut. I was curious if Pale Cascade was coming out. I know that's in the Targon section, but I felt like it's still in the game. It's going to stay. Yeah, I'm not seeing it down here within Targon, and I'm pretty certain it was still in Standard. And so interesting to see that one not going. But nonetheless, all of that is reasonable and well to me. And then I always kind of kick back to this idea of the color pie, the color chart, the faction spread. And to me, Shadow Isles was in kind of a decent place thematically, but they weren't in a very good place competitively. And that's probably not the worst place that you could really be in. I could definitely see the ideas of just cutting cards out that are just complete garbage, like Shape of Fear, and then potentially putting in some more higher tuned cards in the upcoming sets. But there are a couple of oddities in here. I guess that Shadow Isles, just has it well up to this point as to where, like, the defining cards to Shadow Isles to me in terms of removal spells would be Vengeance. But the card that I think really drives home what Shadow Isles does would be Crumble. I'm actually kind of surprised to see Crumble go, since it really carries that kind of theme of idea of not only are we good at removal spells, as with like Vengeance and everything else that just directly kills all of your opposing units, but it also has this kind of sacrifice for greater power kind of ideal to it. And so killing off an ally to kill off an opposing unit or landmark, it seemed like it really kind of tied into that theme to me. And it was a nice activator for a lot of these slay type abilities that care for you to actually come out and kill something. And so I was kind of surprised to see it go. But nonetheless, there's nothing really crazy happening with Shadow Isles. Once you kind of get over the fact that Vagar and Senna are gone, it's much more easier to handle. There are some strange things in here, like you see Opulent Foyer going. I'm not certain that a Gwen deck can ever really survive without the Foyer around, without turning into some kind of combo monstrosity like we used to see with Blue Gwen and the Battle Furies and like. And so kind of odd to see it go, since it just kind of nukes an entire faction. Same thing down here with the likes of things like the Wings and the Wave and the Undying. You start to see a lot of the slay mechanics just kicked out of Shadow Isles, which seem to be like what they're supposed to be good at. And so some of these were failed slay mechanics, like the Burgeoning Sentinel being removed. The 3-drop guy is still in for whatever reason, but it seems like they're just kind of picking and choosing what is going with that. One of the things that does frighten me in terms of these slay things going away, and perhaps some of the reasoning behind it, is if we jump into the cards that are going to be added back in. Thresh and Blighted Caretaker are right in the mix, and I'm pretty certain that Nasus is still in Standard as well. And so with that deck just immediately being available, it probably does need quite a few of these cards pulled out, or day one Thresh Nasus is just going to be an absolutely bonkers deck. And given that it looks to be a fairly go wide unit oriented style of set with Lux coming down in the boost mechanic, I would really worry about having Thresh Nasus be active when you're trying to make a unit based set live right from the get go. The deck would just absolutely shit on anything that wants to just be like an elite style of deck. And so maybe that is kind of the reason you start to see these cards go. It's like, do you really want Thresh Nasus running around in a smaller format just after rotation with the Wings and the Wave and the Undying and the Crumbles and the re-edition of Blighted Caretaker? Probably not. And so at the end of the day, I think that makes a bit of sense. I've never been a huge fan of some of these ephemeral things. It's just been like a failed concept to me. When you see the Haunted Relic and the Onslaught of Shadows tying into the Hecarim kit, it was just always super high rolly to me, and I never thought it was particularly good. Now, I was never a Hecarim Zed player in the space of standard, and with Zed rotating out, maybe it's not nearly as scary, but I always felt like that deck was just a good Zed deck and not particularly a Hecarim deck. And so, but we'll see how these play out. They always just felt kind of memey to me, but it's just as they are kind of in this space of ripping the linear strategies out of the game, then having just play all the ephemeral cards in your deck be a strategy that they're now focusing on is a bit odd. But nonetheless, I feel like these are all reasonable things with Shadow Isles. Nothing really got hammered too hard, and they'll probably still just be another mid-tier faction as the game goes on. If you've been following our play in Backpack Battles as to where in that game, it always feels like it's better to be aggressive than defensive, right? Given the idea of do I want to deal damage or do I want to sustain with heal? It almost always feels better to deal damage. And that's kind of a place it feels like you're in with Legends of Runeterra. There are the kind of outliers with things like Karma Set occasionally being good, but these like classical Shadow Isles removally based control decks have just really never been a thing in LOR. And it just strikes me as something that's just going to be mid at best forever, right? The Mage and Bays of the world that really want to come around and play a control deck in every single format will probably find some kind of way to make some shitty Shadow Isles control deck, but it just strikes me as something that is going to be mid, and it's just something that these changes don't really change anything in that sense. And so, very interesting to see this happen. I don't know how you would really power up Shadow Isles anyways, and without it being on the aggressive end of the spectrum. Are you going to make is it Damnation? Damnation is the Black Wrath of God in Magic. I'm not certain. It's not the Harrowing. That's the fun one that brings all your units back. The Reckoning, right? I don't know. I've never cast it, but those just big like global AOE removal spells tend to just not be very good in this game, and these changes haven't really done anything to affect that. Otherwise, moving into the next set, we see the Shurima changes, and Shurima has really suffered ever since they were released into the game. And the problem with the majority of Shurima has been the Sun Disk. And it's not to say that it's a good or bad mechanic, but once we're now like 3 years out from the release of Shurima, they haven't had the density of cards needed to really push the Sun Disk out of standard, right? And so it's really just been a humongous pain point that Shurima was like released as it was. And with the small number of cards entering the game each year, that it wasn't able to just kind of push that stuff out, right? Because I think they release about 250 cards a year. If you have 10 factions, that's 25 cards per year, but we have the Runeterran champions in the mix as well. And so your faction is realistically getting like 2 or 3 champions and 20 supporting cards. And with that small number, when you need to shove like 6 champions out of standard, you just can't do it. And so it feels like we're able to get like a little bit closer and closer and closer to the Sun Disk cards coming out of standard. As I make all this talk, I'm not certain again as to whether or not Nasus is still in the mix. It seems like a couple of the champions left with the last rotation. Maybe Azir was still around, but it's just this huge pain point having like the entirety of the big Shurima release be a piece of the Sun Disk, and now you just can't get it out. And so, I mean, I don't have the answers to that. It's just been a humongous hole that Shurima has been digging out of. Action that we see being rotated out was the kind of answer, right? If you're not playing Sun Disk, if you're not playing Lurk, there was just like literally nothing else to do in Shurima, and it was Action. Action was the only one that did not have some kind of weird, all in build around with him, right? Talia was all in build around, Lurk was an all in build around. Renekton kind of moved out of that mix, making his way into some of the Warden of the Tribes based overwhelmed decks in the last season, but he hasn't seen any play. Otherwise, it's just been a humongous pain point pushing out from the shadow of the Sun Disk, if you will. And so seeing these cards, like, I'm not certain if any of this really fixes any of those measures. Seeing things like Ascendant's Rise still being a piece of the core set really just drives home what a bunch of nonsense the Sun Disk has been. But hopefully some of these changes will again help a little bit in that space. Like, there's nothing too crazy happening on here. It's probably a positive to see things like Rock Bear Shepherd go if Talia and Ziggs aren't going to be a piece of standard. But, it's very tough to come in here and make cuts in the space that are relevant, because you have to just be like, oh boy, are we going to leave, 20% of the faction just being a half-ass Sundisk deck? It's tough to pull off in that point. And so, again, it looks like some of the stuff is coming out. Some of Azir's kit is going with things like Sandcrafter and Shifting Sands. Voice of the Risen making its way out as well. And so I guess if you're bringing Hecarim back, cutting out some of the Shurima ephemeral stuff makes a little bit of sense. That's fine. I'm not opposed to seeing things like Curse of the Tomb go. It's just a big OTK nonsense card. It's either super good or super bad. It's never anywhere in the middle. And it just doesn't, I don't see any cards in here that be like, wow, Shurima is really going to be hosed from this point forward. It just looks like they've cut out a little bit of some of the kits. But again, I still feel like they're in a space that you could have probably picked like 20 random Shurima cards and put them on the screen and been like, oh, that makes sense. You're trying to cut out Lurk and you're trying to cut out some of the Sun Disk, but you had to leave some of the Sun Disk around and leave some of this other nonsense here. So there's still the correct number of cards. Like, it's just painful. It's just painful. And then even with like the last sets adding in stuff like Nidalee, and Nidalee is more in that space of generic champion, but she's kind of out in terms of synergizing with the other stuff. And so if you're not playing towards ambush, then Nidalee doesn't make a whole ton of sense. There's been a lot of very singular type strategies within Shurima, and so it wouldn't surprise me if this was the hardest faction for them to come in and try and micromanage, since you cut out one thing and then you just have all of these dead cards back and remaining. And so very awkward and odd. It's why, to me, it's why Action has just been around for so long. So they just have to have something that lets you play, Shurima as a supporting cast. In terms of the cards coming back in, very weird to me seeing things like Unworthy. Like, this was something that I thought was always had the potential to be a very interesting mechanic, in the sense of using your mana gems as a resource. It's something that's never really been fleshed out. It just showed up and they're just like, yeah, we printed the rights and then we're never gonna touch on this again. And so I'm kind of curious if there isn't a potential kind of comeback as using the mana gems as a resource, as we do see things like Rite of the Arcane making its way back in as well. But otherwise, the big addition coming from Shurima is going to be the reintroduction of Sivir. Sivir basically plays that same role that Action did in the past, as to where you would play a Demacia deck, it would have Sivir in it, and then you would try and do something degenerate with Sivir, typically with rallies and Demacia, or if you were playing with Noxus, you could give her Overwhelm, and then she would spread Overwhelm to all of your units on the board. It's not a real all-in kind of strategy, as you would see with the likes of Nidalee, right? To where if you're not playing all-in on the ambush deck, Nidalee doesn't really do anything. Sivir doesn't do that, in the sense that every deck just wants to deal damage, and so she does feel like one of these champions that probably just has to be brought back. I'm not opposed to it. I feel like Sivir is a very interesting and strong champion, and so it's good to have her back, but she doesn't do anything to give Shurima identity. And, I think Shurima, kind of suffered from that identity thing, and that, as we talked about a few videos ago with Bandle City, and we say, hey, what's Bandle City's new faction identity going to be? And it's Yordles. Like, it's very strange for that to be an idea, right? When we talked about the Shadow Isles removal identity, it was things like vengeance, targeted removal, sacrificing your units for a greater power gain, right? Those are like themes. But when you say, oh, their identity is Yordles, that's a noun, and it doesn't really make sense. Like I was thinking in terms of, say, bandits. I forget what I was thinking. It was just I was driving somewhere and it hit my head, and it's like you could fit bandit into any faction. You can have a human bandit, you can have a Yordle bandit, you can have a cat bandit. Like it's things that can just apply to anything, and that's what it feels like Yordles is. It's like saying this is the human faction, right? And so where this tangent is going is the Sun Disk is what Shurima has always been. And if literally everything Shurima does isn't centered around the Sun Disk, then they really kind of flop around and flail. And so while Sivir doesn't do anything to help the identity in the sense of this is what Shurima does, this is a place that they're going to be, it at least helps detract from that idea that everything that they do is the Sun Disk. And so, last but not least, we have the purple faction Targon out here. This is another big set of champions rotating out with 4 coming out of Targon. And so I'm not certain what to take of that. I'm not certain what the champion counts are in the game, if we'll see a big onslaught of Targon in the future to kind of make up for it. But some of these, just kind of needed to be done, in my opinion. Yuumi probably needed to go. It seemed like one of these cards that was both thematically away from what Targon likes to do, and it just played in only degenerate decks. And so you would play Yuumi with Elusive, you would play Yuumi with Overwhelms. There was never a fair deck that was potentially interested in having Yuumi in it. And then as we kind of found out during the last seasons as to where Yuumi does give out the bonuses that she gets applied to her. So if you put +2/+2 on Yuumi, you attach it to a unit, the unit dies, she kicks back into hand, then she does still keep that +2/+2, and you get to put it on a unit in the future. And so if you're able to put Spell Shield on Yuumi or Overwhelm onto Yuumi, then she had those big, powerful abilities over and over and over again. And so she probably needed to go. Again, she is one of these cards that was never really involved in a fair deck. It was always just something degenerate. So otherwise, with these, not super upset about any of them going. Nightfall is out. It's fine. Pantheon's faded abilities, I'm not too upset to see go. I feel like Pantheon was really kind of tame and in a good place during the past season, to where he wasn't completely degenerate, and the deck felt very, very mid, very tier 2, but something that was potentially good in best of 3. It's probably just time for him to go. As more keywords get added to the game, he wouldn't surprise me if he was a card that just breaks the game and they really just want Pantheon out. And so kicking him off to Eternal, while not helping in that sense directly, does hopefully alleviate some of those pain points. And then Kayle, I had a pretty good time with Kayle at the end of the last season. A little bit upsetting to see her go to me. She is very useful in the Yordle strategies with Zolani in it and stuff, but I think we played with Kayle in the last Open we played in as well. But again, she doesn't have a lot of direction in terms of what she's doing, and Targon, I think, is probably trying to push itself into more of the spell slingery kind of space. And so again, what is Targon good at? What does Targon do? They aren't really the kind of bruisery style of faction that does a lot of fighting, right? Diana and Pantheon and Kayle don't really make a ton of sense in that realm, as to where if you come into the new cards like Aphelios coming back in, then they do. And so I think it probably makes a bit of sense for those to get kicked out. And then while Taric is a combat-oriented champion, you can kind of think of Taric as a bit of a spell slinger, given that he does copy that spell across his units using his support ability. And so we'll come back to these in just a moment, but I think it makes a bit of sense that way. Otherwise, the Wandering Shepherd coming out, I spoke to the Noxus Weapon Master thinking that they didn't remove all of them. I missed the Wandering Shepherd down here, and she probably needed to go. It was very, I think the improvise mechanic was probably one of the most kind of tooled around with mechanics that Riot has ever had to deal with. And the Wandering Shepherd putting the item onto something else landed into a bit of a pain point. And so that's probably fine. I liked it in the sense that it has a lot going for it, right? It's a multi-faction unit. It's a keyworded unit with Weapon Master. It gets to target, so it can put this ability onto something else. It gets to generate the weapon that you can then reuse later. Just a lot of stuff coming out of the Wandering Shepherd, and it was an all-around powerful thing. Kind of odd to see it to go. Otherwise, with the remainder of the remainder of Targon, you do see the Nightfall mechanics all get ripped out. That's why I think we have so many cards within here. A lot of the cultists going as well. Since the cultist cards have been taken away. The card that surprises me the most out of all of these to see is Esmuth, right? Esmuth really kind of fits the home of where I think elusives should be. And so they are getting, double duty with Lunari Shadestalker coming out, the things like Winged Messenger coming out because it's just a generic elusive. I think, again, like Esmuth is one of the kind of safer ones to be around, which is because it was very interesting in that it does a lot in terms of uh, activating the support mechanic, right? If you have to get your units in combat, they are then at risk of dying. If they die, they can't provide their support abilities. But with Esmuth having elusive, it always had that ability to kind of stick around and get those supports up and running. And so it's an odd one to see go. Since we are seeing the support mechanic kick back into the game into high gear, you can see all of these cards coming back into standard with Tarek and Mountain Sojourners and the Frightened Ibex all being support cards, Mentor of the Stones being support cards as well. So it is kind of odd to see the Targon support card get removed, but maybe it's a bit of too much of a good thing, right? And they don't want like the Tarek deck to just be a big superstar on day one. And Esmuth is a fairly safe cut in that space. But, again, the way I like these elusives, I mentioned Acorn quite a bit in the sense that just having the one, if you only have access to one elusive and it does something interesting, then that's good. The problem with elusives is we get the big density of them as to where your deck is just elusives and you're just trying to non-interact with your opponent and do degenerate stuff. And so I get that Esmuth might need to go in that sense, but it just strikes me as a very odd champion to go at this point. Otherwise, nothing too crazy happening within here. If you just told me we went and took in every Nightfall, Cultist, and Fated card, then that covers off on essentially the entire list here. And so nothing too crazy with Targon. Otherwise, in terms of the cards coming in, Aphelios, I'm not certain how I feel about. I'm not the hugest fan of Aphelios. I guess you have to give something to the spell slingers and enjoyers out there, but it always just strikes me as the kind of card that just takes too long to deal with, right? And so if you have to just like stop and think, and it's like, okay, well, I have to generate a moon weapon first. I have to sequence the stuff right, so we have to think about it. Now I'm going to be generating a moon weapon, but which one do I want to generate next? And so I have to click and look and through all the options and do this and do that. It's just a card that just like really slows down the pacing of every single game, and it's just not something that I'm super fond of. I guess he does bring forth some interesting stuff. I mean, he activates a metric fuck ton of mechanics, be it augment for generated cards or casting spells or giving stuff overwhelm or whatever. Aphelios really does everything. It's just not my favorite champion to play against because I just don't think it's that fun. Otherwise, Tarek coming back, a bit of a frightening champion to see Tarek coming back in the same set as Golden Aegis, right? Everybody already knows that you can cast Golden Aegis on Tarek and attack 3 times in the same turn. Not super excited to see that come back right from the get-go, but I guess if you're wanting to keep rallies in Demacia, then you really only have 3 spell-based choices, and if you're rotating out Lucian, it's a little awkward to keep Relentless Pursuit in, and then Champion Strength just had to go. And so I kind of get it. I'm certain that this is going to be a very straightforward day one deck that we're going to see a ton of in Tarek Demacia, probably Tarek Lux, but it just kind of is what it is. And so you do see the stronger portions of the support kit coming back with the Mountain Sojourners and the Frightened Ibex, and then very interesting to see things like Mountain Goat come back. As much as I hate Aphelios, I do like cards like Mountain Goat. That's what you get when you tell a spell slinger that they have to attack with a unit, they go and look at Mountain Goat, right? And so just being an early game aggressively oriented unit that generates a spell and then the spell creates more combat effectiveness, activates target abilities and stuff, I think that the Mountain Goat is a great card to have back. Otherwise, not super interested in too many of these things. Seeing super cool star chart without Zoe come back is kind of odd, but whatever. And then there's not too much build around stuff here otherwise. And so, interesting changes, interesting set. We've covered off on all of them. I'm very interested to see how these play out as Standard comes forward. As far as spoiler season goes, up to this point, we've seen Lux and Vex and Lilia. I don't recognize Vex and Lilia from League of Legends. They're too new. I recognize them from Teamfight Tactics, and I'm not certain how Lilia, Isla. I don't know. I always called her Lilia. I always call her Liliana because of the magic card. That's what the spelling looks like. But they're coming up. I think there might be one or two more champion releases before the set comes out on Wednesday. And we'll try and get through all of those over the course of the next couple of days. And so, good stuff. Get your Terex ready, get your Thresh Nasus's ready, and we will be out there having some fun. And so that was good. I had fun with that. I hope you did too. It's going to do it for us today. So, hope everyone enjoyed the video. Hope you learned a thing or two along the way. You had a good time watching. This is Busted Me. Thank you for being here.